Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today's episode is called Undeniable, 5 True UFO Encounters. So today I want to focus on cases that I think are undeniable. And by that I mean cases with a lot of evidence, cases with a lot of witnesses. And I have only 5 cases today because each of these are really extensive and do contain a lot of evidence, including landing traces, electromagnetic disturbances, animal reactions, physiological evidence, and more. The cases I'm presenting today come from across the United States, but one is from Canada. They have a lot of witnesses. These are absolutely undeniable cases. So I think, it's important that people recognize there is evidence to support the reality of UFOs. It always makes me kind of shake my head when people say, "Where's the evidence?" I've said it many times, but it's worth repeating. The best evidence we have is the huge number of cases. It's undeniable that this is a true phenomena. Anyone who takes even the briefest look at the evidence can only come away convinced, presuming they can do this objectively. But these 5 cases, I think, alone present enough evidence to prove the reality of UFOs and extraterrestrial visitations on our planet. So that's the theme of today's show. I hope you find it interesting. There's some really remarkable landing cases, a missing time encounter, all different kinds of encounters that are absolutely undeniable. So the first case I'd like to talk about today is I call UFO landing at South Hill, Virginia. This one created a huge uproar in the UFO community. The debunkers came out in full force, I think because it has such good evidence to it, as we'll see. This one occurred on April 21st, 1967, of course in South Hill, Virginia, a small little town. But boy, something happened there on that day that put that town on the map. The primary witness in this case is a gentleman by the name of Clifton Crowder, who at the time of this encounter was the manager and former owner of the mobile chemical fertilizer plant, also a veteran of the Air Force from World War II. So he was an active member of this small town of South Hill, Virginia, which then had a population of about 3,000 people. He was very well respected, and in fact, Sergeant Cecil Raines of the Virginia State Police said, "Crowder is the finest man in our area." Now, the evening of April 21st, 1967 would have a profound impact on Clifton's life and really the whole town. On that evening, he had worked until about 9 p.m. He was just leaving the mobile plant to drive the short distance to his home. He turned off the little dirt road and onto the paved surface of Ferrell Road. It was paved with macadam. This will be an important detail, as we'll see. And I'll just let Clifton Crowder describe what happened in his own words. As he says, "When I hit the hard surface, I saw the huge craft on the road. It had a shiny metallic appearance and was highly reflective. My immediate reaction was to throw my lights up on high beam so I could see what it was. I saw the craft clearly for at least 5 seconds. It was about half the height of a large metal storage tank, perhaps 12 feet in diameter and 15 to 20 feet high. It seemed to be sitting on legs about 3 feet high. Suddenly, there was a blinding flash of white fire from the bottom of the thing. I don't remember hearing any sound at all. I thought I saw the craft go up from the ground, but all of this happened fast, and the intense light may have blinded me for an instant. When I was over the surprise, I bent down and looked up through the windshield. I didn't see anything in the sky except the moon and some clouds. But there was a fire on the road directly beneath the place where the craft had been. It looked as if something had ignited the macadam surface. The fire must have burned for about 20 seconds while I was making up my mind to go by. Finally, it began to die down, and I headed for the town police station. I felt that I wouldn't be a responsible citizen without reporting what I saw, unbelievable though it may have been. It was just a funny feeling. You can imagine how it felt to see a big thing like that sitting in the road in front of you, and all of a sudden a ball of fire flies out and it disappears. It went straight up in the air like a bullet. It was just a flash and it was gone. And when I had my bright lights on, I got a perfect look at it. So yeah, this was apparently a metallic craft, which reminded him of a sort of metal tank, and off it went very quickly. So although it was a brief sighting, he did get a good look at it. He says this object was no more than 300 feet from him, and he arrived at the police station at precisely 9:04 p.m. He told the officers what had happened, and they returned to the scene with him. And shortly later, 2 other officers came up. The burned spot on the road was plainly visible, and in fact was still hot. They measured it. It was 3.5 feet long and about 2 feet wide. And Clifton personally was glad to see it because it proved that he had not imagined this sighting. Now at this point he's offering no conclusion about what he saw. He wondered actually if it might have been, quote, some object the government is experimenting with and the general public knows nothing about. So this is when the investigation began. Clifton the next day went to the home of Norman Martin, who lived about 1,200 feet away from the spot where he had seen this craft. He's the closest house to it. And I'll just let Clifton describe what happened. As Clifton says in his own words, I asked Norman if he'd heard or seen anything unusual around 9 the night before. Norman said he had. He'd been standing in his backyard, and all of a sudden he noticed the biggest burst of light he'd ever seen. It cast a light on an oak tree just a few feet down the road from where I saw the craft. Norman told me it was so bright he could have shot a bird right out of the tree if he'd wanted to. That's pretty bright at about 400 yards. So, later researchers did find other witnesses. They learned that Linda Clark, another resident who lived nearby, said that at the time of the incident, she saw an intense flash of light. And so apparently did her young child, who had been sound asleep in bed, but woke up and cried out in surprise. And as it turned out, there were quite a few witnesses. 5 South Hill residents said that they saw strange lights around 9:30, and they were talking back and forth about it on their CB radios. They described it as a red glowing sphere which was changing in color from orange to yellow, was dropping down to treetop level, coming back up, appearing to divide into 2 objects, which came back together and dropped down again. They then came back up, and now there were 3 objects. One of the men, Roy Edmonds, stopped his car and tried to call the police from his home. But it was weird. His phone was strangely not operating. So he went back out and he could see this cluster of lights still moving up and down. And there were more witnesses. Around 8:30 p.m., an hour before the 5 South Hill residents with their radios, and a half hour prior to Clifton Crowder's report, South Hill police dispatcher Norman Ball and 4 others said that they saw, quote, a pinkish ball of fire, which was moving around at treetop level. They said it was stationary at first, then moved slowly away and disappeared behind a hill. Now, several members of the Fort Lee Fire Department said that around 9:15 p.m., they saw 2 strange red lights revolving in the sky for about 5 minutes. This is just 50 miles east of South Hill, Virginia. One of them, James Hajakos, described how they saw this light descend to an altitude of about 600 feet. Then it came straight at them, turned 90 degrees, and moved slowly towards the northeast. And there were still more witnesses. Police Chief Bill Williams of La Crosse, which is just 3 miles southeast of South Hill, he said that he and several other officers saw 5 what looked like star-like lights rising up from the ground in the South Hill area and moving to the northeast. And Police Chief Bill Williams actually got in his cruiser and chased one of these lights for about 2 miles, racing up to 75 miles per hour. He said the object he chased was at about treetop level, and he said, quote, that he's never seen anything like that. So, back to Clifton Crowder's event. As the police returned the next day to investigate, they were looking at the road and the burn spot, and they found more evidence. They found 4 small holes surrounding the burn spot. They were about 1 inch deep, 1.5 inches wide, or rather a 1/2 inch wide, and spaced evenly in a rectangular pattern about 12 feet apart. And they speculated that these holes may have been caused by the landing legs of the craft that Clifton had described. And there were more weird events to follow. It was just 18 hours after Clifton's sighting of this landed UFO on the road, long before there was any publicity about it. Clifton said he was approached by an Air Force colonel and a sergeant who questioned him extensively about the sighting. Now, they did a lot of investigating to find out who this Air Force colonel was, and he has never been located. But this story, this sighting, started to get a lot of attention, particularly because of the landing traces, and crowds started to show up to take a look at it. Newspaper reporters interviewed Clifton Crowder, and articles began to appear in various newspapers. This is when J. Allen Hynek, who is, of course, a consultant to Project Blue Book, the Air Force UFO Study Project, I'll put that in quotes, but J. Allen Hynek heard about the encounter, and he couldn't come there himself, so he sent his assistant, William T. Powers, to investigate. And William Powers began, of course, by interviewing Clifton Crowder, and he was immediately impressed with his sincere testimony. And in fact, William Powers told the police, quote, "Crowder is telling exactly what he saw, and there is no reason to disbelieve him. However, I can't account for what he saw." So the police really wanted to do some further investigation, and they tried to see if they could duplicate the holes in the pavement by forcing a 1/2 inch bolt into the macadam. Of course, they couldn't do this, so they next tried to reproduce the burn mark, the heat source, and along with William Powers, they tried first pouring kerosene onto the road and lighting it with a blowtorch, but it wouldn't ignite without a wick. They also tried gasoline, and while it did burn, it produced clouds of black smoke, it streaked all over the place, and none of this matched what Clifton said he saw. Furthermore, the gasoline burned on the road for about 20 minutes, where Clifton said that what he saw was about 1 minute of flames. And as William Powers says, "We investigated the idea of a hoax, but we couldn't prove it." Now, William Powers did remove samples of the burn spot on the road and sent them off to, you can probably guess where, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base for analysis. Wright-Patterson is, of course, UFO Central, where they study foreign aircraft. So that makes sense, but it's certainly interesting because they did agree to analyze this sample. And it gets more interesting. The results were inconclusive, they said. While the macadam surface did show evidence of high heat, there was no evidence of any fuel source. And Dr. J. Allen Hynek said that Crowder's experience, quote, "defied explanation." Now this is when the debunkers started to come in, and rumors began to spread that 3 burned matches were found at the site, laying neatly side by side. This report came a few days after the investigation. There's no photo evidence to back it up, or any report on who allegedly found these matches. I think personally that this is an attempt to discredit Crowder's story. That's my personal speculation. Perhaps matches were found. However, it made little difference in the story itself, as the analysis of the road showed no presence of the fuel accelerant. And there was still the matter of the 4 evenly spaced holes surrounding the burn spot, which could not be explained or easily hoaxed. Not to mention the fact that there were so many witnesses to activity in this area at that time. Nevertheless, famous debunker Philip Klass devoted no less than 19 pages to this case in his book, UFOs Explained, and tried very hard to label this incident as a hoax, but he couldn't find anyone who could cast any dispersions on the main witness, Clifton Crowder, whose reputation in the community was sterling. There was some speculation that Clifton may have been the victim of a prank, but again, there was no evidence of this whatsoever. Debunkers tried to focus on the fact that this fertilizer factory had tanks next to it, and that he had mistaken the object in the road for one of the tanks, which makes 0 sense. There was also a theory being floated around that he had seen ball lightning, which fails to match even closely what Crowder had seen, nor could it explain the 4 holes in the pavement, nor the many other sightings other people had reported. So ultimately, the Air Force Project Blue Book labeled this case, case number 11677, as unexplained. And today, the case remains a mystery. And given the huge number of eyewitnesses, again, who saw unexplained UFO activity both before, during, and after Crowder's sighting, it seems undeniable that something unexplained occurred. When debunkers attack a case like this so viciously, to me that definitely raises eyebrows. If this is a hoax, as, say, Philip Klass admits, why is he spending so much attention to it? Just dismiss it. I think this is because it's a valid case. And it clearly is, with so many other witnesses who saw UFO activity before and after Clifton Crowder saw this UFO land in the middle of the road and leave these absolutely undeniable landing traces. What a case. And there's so many others. Here's another one that's definitely worth looking into. It's not well known at all. I call this one UFO Lands at Iowa Farm. And this is actually a cluster of incidents. There was a lot of activity going on at this time in this area. This particular case occurred on April 6, 1971 in Westgate, Iowa. And I like this case because there are multiple witnesses from separate areas who watched this UFO come down and land. And of course, it left landing traces. And there are corroborating cases that occurred around that time in that area as well. So it's a really remarkable series of events. This next case is much more brief, but there's a whole cluster of events that surround it. This one occurred around 10 p.m., again April 6, 1971, when Don Eade, age 17, looked outside his home in Westgate and saw this brilliant flash of light in the sky, followed by a red-orange glowing object, which he watched drop down from the sky and appear to hover or land a short distance away. Now, unknown to him, and a short distance away, Mike Potratz, age 17, was in his house, and he saw the same exact thing, a flash followed by a brightly lit object coming down for an apparent landing. So again, this was at 10 p.m. The next morning, both boys hiked to the location where they had seen this object come in for a landing. They had to go to school that day, but they went before school. And where they had seen it come in for landing was at a small farm owned by James Bantz. So they went to investigate, and they were joined by Russell Bantz. Don and Mike went to the Bantz farm, and this is when they were amazed to see this circular area of burned vegetation, which was about 10 feet wide. And surrounding this circle of burned vegetation were 4 smaller circles evenly spaced around the circumference. So clearly an object containing a high heat source had landed on the farm. That's all we know about that case, but in confirmation of it is another case which occurred on the very same evening, not far away, in Osceola, Iowa. And I'll just quote the anonymous witness directly. He reported his case to UFO organizations, and as he says, and I quote, "I was 10 years old. Me and my dad's friend were traveling down US Highway 34 going back to Murray, Iowa. It was about 8 o'clock p.m. I looked out the window at the stars. That's when I noticed the disc. It was about 4 or 5 feet in diameter. I asked my dad's friend, 'What is that?' He didn't notice it at first. When he did, I asked him, 'What's that?' He said, 'I don't know.' It followed us about 15 feet above the car. I don't remember how long, but when we got to the house, we told my mom and dad and my dad's friend's wife. They started laughing at us and said we were crazy. My dad's friend told me to forget about it, so I did. It was years later, in 2009, that he was surfing the internet and heard about UFOs, and this is when he suddenly remembered the encounter, which apparently had left his mind, something we do see in these UFO encounters. But incredible corroboration of an event of this landing, which he saw this just, 2 hours before this landing in Westgate, Iowa. Now, apparently UFOs seemed to be very interested in Iowa farms in 1971 because consider this report, which occurred in Sioux City about 3 months before the Westgate case on January 15, 1971. And again, I'll just quote the witness directly, as he says, "My friend and I were on a country highway between Sioux City and Westfield, Iowa. We were coming up on a farmer's house and both of us yelled out, 'What's that?' We pulled off to the side of the road and turned the car off. We watched a UFO hovering over the farmer's house very close to the roof. Then it slowly started moving towards us. We just sat in our car and watched. It moved to my side of the car and stopped. I believe it was looking at us, and we at them. It had a few small lights, and the sound didn't sound like anything I have heard before. It was very quiet. After a couple minutes, it started moving across the highway and over a cornfield. After a matter of seconds, it went very fast and disappeared in the distance over cornfields." And further corroboration, there was another UFO landing at an Iowa farm on that same year, September 1st, in Humboldt, Iowa, which was about 200 miles from Westgate. For us, that's a pretty long distance, but for a UFO, 4 or 5 seconds they can make it there. But as the witness says, and again I quote, "My brother and I were traveling eastbound on State Highway 3, approximately 4 to 5 miles west of Humboldt, Iowa. The sky was clear, and there was not any other traffic. I was returning him home to our parents, as he was 13 or 14 years old. He had been visiting me in the western part of the state. We were talking as I drove along, and as if out of a science fiction movie, a large craft just appeared above and to the left of the road, about 1 or 2 miles in front of us. I mean, I was looking ahead, and when this large craft just appears in the sky, it was descending and was tilted down at about a 45-degree angle. It then leveled itself over the highway, then descended again, tilted down as before, and left my sight, as there was a farm building sight with a grove of trees blocking my sight. That's when I turned to my brother and I found him looking at me. At the same time, we both said, "Did you see that?" We're still traveling east and getting closer to where we saw this thing land. And I say land because we're in Iowa and we can see the farm place and all around the vicinity for a long way. I mean, we were really wondering what this was going to look like on the ground and close enough to the road to throw a rock at and be able to hit it to make a point. Probably a minute after we lost it from sight, we were passing the farm place, and there wasn't anything there except a harvested bean field. We arrived at our parents' house a couple of hours later and told them about what we had seen. Understand, it's been 33, 34 years since this took place. But our oldest sister, who was 17 at the time, it was either 1 or 2 weeks later, brought my attention to the Des Moines Sunday Register. On the front page, the second bold type heading read, "Mysterious burn spots found in soybean fields." So newspaper accounts showed more landings at Iowa farms continuing through 1972. Clearly there was something going on there, so it seems undeniable that UFOs, at that time certainly, were finding Iowa farms a location of intense interest. UFOs do seem to love visiting farms for whatever reason. I mean, we can certainly speculate about that. But the fact is, there are a lot of cases where UFOs are landing at farms and leaving behind evidence of all different kinds. Just love that case. And here's another one that is so amazing. I call this one the Colby, Kansas UFO landing. And this is really a remarkable case which occurred on August 19, 1972, of course in Colby, Kansas, and in surrounding areas. This one involves a huge number of witnesses, including quite a few police officers. This is not necessarily a singular event, though I am going to focus mostly on one event. But the fact is, a lot of stuff was going on that night, and it was a really amazing series of events that deserves a lot more attention than I think it's gotten. So that's why I wanted to include it on this list, and I am sure you'll agree it's a fascinating series of UFO encounters. This case is so amazing. It was at exactly 2:07 a.m. August 19, 1972, when a call came into the Thomas County Sheriff's Office, which covers Colby, Kansas, reporting a UFO. And the call came from 23-year-old John A. Calkins. He was awakened 7 minutes earlier at 2 a.m. by his dogs barking, and looking outside, he saw 3 glowing objects in the sky over his mobile home. This is in the town of Gem, which is right next to Colby, Kansas. He went outside. These objects quickly rose out of sight and disappeared. But the strangeness wasn't over yet, because as John Calkins says, "Then I heard funny noises, high-pitched sounds, and swooshing sounds like a vacuum cleaner." So he went inside and called the police, then went back outside and saw the objects again. They were flashing, changing different colors. In fact, they lit up the area so bright that he could see his dog outside, and his dog was putting its head on the ground, apparently trying to cover its ears. As John says, "I knew then these were high, shrilling sounds." And as he watched, an object dropped down and, get this, appeared to land on the roof of a Quonset building about 150 feet away from his trailer. He said this object was pretty big, about 25 to 35 feet in diameter, he estimates, 15 to 20 feet tall, and your classic saucer shape with a dome on top. And as John Calkins says in his own words, "The lights on it were so bright I couldn't stand to look at it. When I seen that one, I got so scared I got cold. I broke out in goosebumps. I had to turn on the heater in the trailer." So this is when he called the police, and Patrolman Paul Carter was sent to investigate. And little did he know he wouldn't get there, and he was about to drive into the most unusual experience of his life. So he left the police station in Colby, Kansas, went down Main Street, turned south onto Country Club Drive, as you can see here, and just before reaching Interstate 70, off to his left, in a field, he saw something he would never forget. So I'll just let Patrolman Paul Carter describe how all of this occurred. As he says in his own words, "I saw an object coming out of the northeast in a southwesterly direction. It was big, very bright, changing from red and green blinking colors to bright white, so bright you couldn't look at it. It lit up the pasture. I watched this object for 15 to 20 seconds. All the time it was flashing red and green. It resembled a cereal bowl turned upside down, and it was about 35 feet wide and about 18 to 20 feet long. Now, when he first saw it, it was quite low, about 200 to 300 feet high. He chased it for a few minutes, traveling about 50 to 60 miles per hour, when it suddenly stopped, swung back, and stopped over the field east of Country Club Drive, north of the Interstate 70. And at this point, it's hovering about 300 feet away and came down, either landing in the field or was about no more than 10, say 15 feet above the ground, and lit up the surrounding area super bright, bright enough that Paul could see the jackrabbits in the field. In fact, it was bright enough to illuminate the entire interior of his vehicle. And he said as it hovered there, he could see little bits of, quote, white stuff that were dropping down, but looked like they were dissolving before they hit the ground. But he said that the mere sight of this craft was unnerving, and this was when it flared up so brightly he couldn't even look at it. And I'll just let Paul give a little description. As he says, Patrolman Paul Carter, "It sure doesn't make you feel like getting out and dancing the minuet. It's eerie. We all kind of laughed at this stuff in the past, but after 2:07 this morning, I changed my opinion real fast. I was a firm non-believer until 7 minutes after 2, but I found I could change my mind pretty fast." So seeing this UFO just sitting there, he immediately radioed for assistance back at the station. And Patrolman Dennis Brown answered the call and immediately headed for the area. Meanwhile, Paul is watching this UFO for about 8 minutes total, when suddenly the object, quote, made a whooshing sound and went straight up into the sky, with the intense white light going out as it lifted off. It didn't shut off any lights, it just went straight up. So it disappeared, he says, in about 3 seconds. But Officer Dennis Brown is approaching Paul's location, and looking over his shoulder, he saw a, quote, streak of light going west to east on the horizon, but I really didn't have time to wonder because I was on my way to help Carter. This was apparently a separate craft, because then he saw a glow coming up from behind the hill, and he was just about there when he watched this UFO take off. And he, like Patrolman Paul Carter, watched this craft move across the sky. And he had the presence of mind to grab his Instamatic camera and snap a photo. As Dennis says in his own words, "I saw a shot of light go straight up into the air and then veer or level off to travel in a southwesterly direction. It was weird, but it made a believer out of me. Before, I always thought people who reported these sightings had been tipping the jug, and then thought they saw what they reported." So, needless to say, he changed his mind about UFOs just like Officer Paul Carter. Dennis Brown noticed that this light was heading towards Oakley, which is about 20 miles away. So he called the Oakley police station and told them to be on the lookout for strange objects in the sky. And 3 minutes later, they called back. As it turned out, Officer Earl Wood Jr. saw the UFO, And as he says, there appeared to be 6 lights on the object, the 3 to the rear being white, and the 3 to the front being either amber or red and green. They continuously flashed from dim to bright. There was no trouble identifying that it was a circular object. So like Officer Carter, Officer Woods noticed that this object looked like it was dripping this weird white substance which disintegrated before it hit the ground. He said it hovered for about 5 minutes and then darted away. So now Paul Carter and Dennis Brown head over to GEM to talk to John Calkins. This is just a few miles to the east. And when they arrived there, they were amazed to see that this UFO had returned. And now it was flashing multicolored lights. The officers looked absolutely shocked, John said. As John Calkins says in his own words, they were white as sheets. I never seen a police officer as scared as that in my life. So the 2 officers actually watched this object from their patrol cars, and it was just hovering in place. So Paul wanted to see if it was moving at all, so he used a sort of ingenious technique. As he says, we extended an arm, locking it and bracing it against the car roof and sighting the UFO over an extended thumb. And they could see that this object was, in fact, sort of swaying back and forth in a rocking motion. So they then returned to Colby, and these UFOs were still in the sky. And they watched them for the next few hours, joined by a crowd of 15 to 20 other people in the area. And again, these objects were hovering, swaying back and forth. One darted to the northeast, moving towards Rexford, only 9 miles away, then stopped. They actually chased it in their car for a short distance, but it went out of their jurisdiction area. So they stopped and watched it for several hours as it was joined by 4 to 8 smaller objects. And as Dennis Brown says, the smaller lights moved from the west to the east and back again, sometimes moving from one horizon to the other in less than 5 seconds. And they noticed something very interesting and I think significant. These objects were flying in very strange patterns, making what looked like geometric shapes, circles and squares. They would scatter and then group up together again. Now, while they were all watching this, the police station back in the city of Colby was ringing off the hook. The phone calls were coming in like mad. And in fact, there was 36 calls which came into the station. One farmer said that one of these objects actually dropped from the sky and hovered no more than 3 feet above his barn. Now the next morning, John Calkins, who was back in GEM, inspected the Quonset building where he had seen this UFO apparently land on top of, but he found no evidence of any kind. The next morning, officers Carter and Brown examined the field where Paul Carter had seen this object hovering or landing. They found no evidence there either. Of course, afterwards, Dennis Brown was very excited to develop his pictures, but was very disappointed to find that they didn't show anything. He had taken a number of pictures. Now, one did show a white light, but he said it was just unclear, wouldn't convince any skeptics, but almost all of them were blank, which made no sense to them. They felt almost as if they had been somehow not so much tampered with, but the UFO wouldn't let them take pictures. But it was absolutely an event which changed their minds about UFOs forever. And as Patrolman Paul Carter says, and I quote, "You'd think we were maniacs, except for all the people who saw this. It's true. That's all I can say about it. I wouldn't be making an ass out of myself if it wasn't." What an amazing series of events. It's really unfortunate the photographs didn't come out in that case, because that really would have cemented it into UFO history. But the best evidence for that case, I think, is the huge number of witnesses. I mean, how many police officers have to see UFOs for people to say, okay, there is something to this? So I'm really glad that these witnesses came forward. Most don't, especially if you've got a career that, your reputation might become tarnished by stepping forward. But they did, and I think it was because there were so many of them seeing UFOs on that night. And now we move to the next case I'd like to cover, which is a little bit different from the previous three we've been talking about. I call this one Missing Time in Prince George. This occurred on January 5, 1977, of course in Prince George, which is located in British Columbia, Canada. This case involves two primary witnesses who were driving along a lonely highway out in the country, and they don't know each other, but they came together and both experienced this really quite unusual missing time event and a very close-up UFO sighting. And one of them, the primary witness, this turned out to be the first of many encounters. And this is a case with physical evidence as well, including electromagnetic effects, physiological evidence, and of course, multiple witnesses. This case was investigated numerous times by different researchers and again involves a very unusual missing time UFO encounter. The primary witness is a young 17-year-old gentleman by the name of Kirk Allore. And it was around 4:10 a.m. on January 5, 1977, and he was driving his 1977 GMC pickup along a straight stretch of the Yellowhead Highway, Highway 16, about 30 miles outside of the city of Prince George. So 4:10 a.m., he hadn't passed a single car when he finally did see another oncoming car ahead of him about a half-mile away. And it was at this exact time he saw something else, a glowing red object hovering over some power lines up ahead. And as Kirk Allore says in his own words, "I noticed this red light move, and as I watched, it just shot right over the top of the car that was coming towards me. I stared at it in amazement, as if I had the urge to look at it. Then it just shot towards me. At the time, the oncoming car was about 300 yards away, if that. It just shot towards me. It was huge. It took up about 2 highway widths, and it just came right towards me." So this object was the strangest looking craft Kirk had ever seen. It almost looked, he said, like an octopus or a strange creature coming at him. And again, I will just let him describe this in his own words, and he gives a very vivid description. Says Kirk, "To me, it looked like a giant lizard with wings, and it was a little over 1.5 times the size of the road width. It was sort of oblong. The outer shell looked like alligator skin because of the texture, the ripples in it, and the color was dull, somewhat like alligator skin. There was no definite glow. It had little protruding wings, except they were more rounded. Underneath, it had a circular thing moving, like an electric razor, a disc turning inside the other. It had a dome on top, and that's where the light was coming from. It had all different colored lights inside of it, like green, red, yellow, blue, sort of little dots. I noticed that they were constantly changing back and forth. One would go one way, while inside there would be one going the other way. I just stared at that thing for the longest time when it was over top of the oncoming car, and I noticed everything in great detail. I don't think it was like anything we could build. That's how strange it looked, and that's what scared me. It didn't look like anything I had seen before, except maybe the lizard part. That's the only thing I could relate it to. So when this craft zoomed towards him and got real close, a red light came from the dome of the craft and lit up the entire interior of his car. At this point, Kirk was in a state of total panic, and he noticed that the radio in his car, which was on, started to fail. The transmission started becoming crackling, and it just wasn't working. The headlights went out, and the car engine failed. As Kirk says, I noticed that I had no engine power left. There was just nothing there. Everything locked up. Power steering. So the motor must have died. I got strange sensations, such as my arms or legs falling asleep, like pins and needles. Then I swerved and missed this thing, for it was coming right for me, and it all happened so fast. I don't remember anything after that. I sort of knocked out. I sort of blacked out, I guess. I felt as if there were a bunch of pins in me, and then I just sort of went into nothing. The last thing I remember was my motor dying, my radio going funny, and seeing this guy not more than 100 yards away from and heading straight for me. I was going at least 70 miles per hour. I remember putting my foot on the brake. Now, Kirk had never fainted before in his life, so this was new to him. But the next thing Kirk knew, the guy from the oncoming car was opening his car door on the passenger side. Kirk was not in his driver's seat anymore. He was sitting in the passenger seat. And this guy from the oncoming car was shaking him and asked him, "Are you all right?" Kirk said, "Yeah, I guess so. I'm okay." But he really wasn't, because as Kirk says, I was sort of sick at the moment. I felt like I had been looked over. I was aching all over. My arms, everything was sore. Really aching. I ached all over for a few days. Now Kirk saw by his watch and the other man's watch that about 15 minutes had elapsed. So they had both been apparently unconscious for that length of time. And it was weird because their cars were now 2 feet apart. The other witness was driving a 1974 or 75 Pontiac Le Mans, but it looked to both of them as though they had missed having a head-on collision by mere inches. And in fact, the other witness told Kirk, and I quote, "The strangest thing happened to me. I came to standing outside of my car." And he began to explain to Kirk that he had seen this unexplained red light in his rear view mirror, saw it moving towards his car, and when it did, like Kirk, he got these prickly feelings all over his body, and the last thing he remembered seeing was Kirk's car zooming towards him, and he, like Kirk, passed out. So Kirk was amazed. As he says, "As for me, I was in the passenger's seat when he shook me. We could find no skid marks. I was doing at least 70 miles an hour when I swerved into his lane, and there were no skid marks." So both Kirk and the other witness, for some reason he never got his name, they went straight to the hospital in Vanderhoof and were examined by doctors who found nothing wrong with them. So once he got home, he did report his case, and reporters and investigators converged. He says he took a polygraph test, one of the reporters asked him to, and then he started talking to investigators, and they called up the hospital and were unable to confirm his visit with the hospital staff. But they did talk to Kirk's parents, who said that yes, Kirk had in fact called them from the hospital, and Kirk told them that the doctors had refused to take his report seriously, which is what Kirk said. They just kind of laughed at him. Following this sighting, Kirk said he had nightmares, but he didn't want to talk to investigators and tell them what these nightmares were about. But he says he also suffered from headaches for a few days. And not only that, the battery of his pickup truck, which he had purchased not that long ago, was nearly dead. He also said that his watch stopped working. It kept stopping following the incident. And it was not long after that he started to see more UFOs. One dropped down near his house in May of 1977, and this time was viewed by his family and his neighbors. And it was just a few months later, at 11:25 p.m., On November 3rd, 1977, Kirk, who's now 18, was walking with his girlfriend, Mary Ann Sampson, along Old Parents Beach Road on the south shore of Stewart Lake when they both saw a glowing red sphere not far away. Now Kirk, remembering his previous encounters, began to freak out. But Mary Ann was curious, so she convinced him to approach this object along with her, and they got close, and they could see that it was an object about the size of a small car, was giving off blue sparks, and they approached to about 300 feet when they felt this weird force field actually stop them, and that scared them. So they ran back to their car and drove off, only to find that this object was now following them. And in fact, for 1.5 hours it followed them. Not only following them, but playing this sort of cat and mouse game, suddenly appearing in the middle of the road when they would come around a corner. At one point, Kirk pulled a U-turn to get away from this object and kept going, and the object was there again in front of them. It paced them at treetop level. It crossed the road in front of them. They were freaking out, so finally they just pulled over into a farmhouse and called the police. And the police came and investigated, and they could smell this weird electrical odor where this object had been. And it was following this encounter that both Kirk and Mary Ann began having strange dreams about the incident, at least one of which they said was the same exact dream. And once again, they refused to elaborate on this to investigators, but I suspect it involved perhaps an onboard encounter. That's pure speculation. I don't know. But it's not unusual for someone to have dreams about an onboard experience that they don't remember, that is shrouded in missing time. Who knows? But the UFOs weren't over yet. In January of 1978, the UFO returned and paced Kirk and Mary Ann again in their car. So since his initial encounter, he had a total of 4 other sightings. And it's a kind of a joke in his family. They're always asking him if he's seen any UFOs, but he frankly does not like to talk about them because the whole subject still frightens him. He had never believed in UFOs, but as he says, I do now. I didn't before, but I do now. You can see how profoundly the witness was affected in this case, and I think that's probably the rule rather than the exception, particularly when someone has a missing time encounter, which, as I'm sure you know, is probably an onboard encounter. But, this is something that people deal with their entire lives. Many people do have a single UFO encounter, but if it's a missing time encounter, more than likely this is going to be something that's ongoing, and that's certainly true in Kirk Allure's case. But a really amazing case with quite a bit of evidence and, again, multiple witnesses. And now we move to the next case, one of the most interesting, I think, in this little collection. I call this one the Greenfield UFO Landing. This is a really amazing case which occurred on November 8, 1975 in Greenfield, Indiana. And this case came to attention because these 2 sisters had a very close-up encounter on their farm, the parent landing, and they wanted answers. So they went really public with their encounter, and it led to a lot of publicity, and their case was very extensively researched, and it turned out it was not a single event. All kinds of UFO activity was going around in that area at that time. It created quite a controversy, and it's just a super fascinating and well-verified case with some incredible landing trace evidence. So this is the 5th and final case in this collection, and it was somewhere around 7 p.m., again on November 8, 1975, when Kathy Wilfong, who's 23 years old, and her sister Cindy Bridges, who's 21 years old, were at their farmhouse which is located somewhere between 300 and 400 north and 525 east in Greenfield, Indiana. And it was again at 7 p.m. when the electricity in the farmhouse suddenly went out. The two sisters lived on separate houses on the farm. They have a total of 3 kids together, but they were together at the time Kathy's husband was away on a business trip in Alabama. So they decided to go out and check the circuit breaker, which went off. So they put it back on, but it went off again. And in fact, this happened 4 or 5 times over a period of 15 or 20 minutes. As Kathy says, we just couldn't keep the lights lit. So it was around 7:30 or so when these unexplained electrical malfunctions finally stopped, and they thought that was the end of it. But unknown to them, it was just the beginning. And it was 2 hours later, around 9 p.m., Cindy went outside and got into the camper trailer because, as she says, I needed the headlights to see to get some firewood out of the barn. And this is when she noticed some, quote, pulsating lights coming from their soybean field to the north. And she instantly realized that she was seeing something quite large, very unusual, and she honked the car horn to attract her sister. So Kathy, her sister, knew something was wrong when she heard her sister screaming. Also, their little dog, Babe, was barking out of control. So Kathy ran outside and saw this huge object covered with strange lights. She could see her sister in the camper, and Kathy immediately ran back inside and called the sheriff's department first, and then called her mother. She told the police, "Would you please send someone out here in a hurry? There's a UFO out here." So that took her just about 1 minute, and then she ran back outside. And Cindy, who estimates that she stayed in the truck about 4 minutes, finally worked up the nerve to get out. She exited the truck and was running back to the house when Kathy was coming out. So Kathy went looking into the garage for the camera, but it turned out her husband had taken it, so they couldn't take any pictures of this. But together, the two of them watched this craft hovering just above the ground for about 12 or 15 minutes. And both of them decided to retreat inside and watched as this craft rose upward and stayed there. It was not moving off. It was moving off a little bit, but was still visible in the area. And it was huge. They described this craft as, quote, bigger than the barn, which was 100 feet long. They said it was shaped like an upside-down bowl, and the whole time they watched it, it was tilted at an angle, kind of showing its underside. They could see 2 white lights on one end and a red light on the other, with a red circle in the center. And they drew it, as you can see. And as Cindy says, I never saw it on the ground. It was about 60 feet up in the air when I seen it, just hovering there over the field. I thought at first an airplane had crashed. It was so big. But then I realized there was no sound, and I saw that it was a UFO. I started honking for Kathy to come out and yelling, UFO! UFO! It looked like it was in 3 sections, like a rectangle. And the 2 end sections were pointed down at the ground at a 20-degree angle. And in the middle section, there was some type of round circle. We couldn't tell if the circle was even with it, or protruding out from it, or up into it. There was just definitely a round circle in it. The craft was a grayish-green color. It had 2 white lights on it, 1 red, and the lights never started pulsating until it was moving. And then it was moving, the lights started, never blinking off, but got brighter and dimmer. It was just so huge, and it didn't make a noise, and that's what scared me. The thing moved like it was in slow motion. So Kathy verifies all of this, as she says, when I saw this thing, all this light, I panicked. I ran into the house, called the sheriff's department, then I called our mother. I ran outside, left my mother hanging on the phone. When I did talk with my mother, I just kept yelling, UFO! UFO! So meanwhile, back at the sheriff's office, calls were flooding in from all over the county reporting UFOs. One man said he was driving along Interstate 70 and saw what he thought were several helicopters flying low over his car. Another woman in McCordsville said that she saw unexplained lights. Kathy and Cindy's mother, who lived about 6 miles away, arrived shortly later, and she actually saw the lights from this object as she approached. But by the time she got at the farm, the lights were pretty much off in the distance, but still clearly visible. And it was a short time later that the 2 deputies from the sheriff's office showed up at the Wilfong's residence. Now the sisters say it was a half an hour after they called. However, there's some dispute about this, and in fact Sheriff Malcolm Gross denied this. He said that the Wilfong's call came at 9:02 and that the deputies arrived at 9:08. However, the farm is 8 miles from the sheriff's office, so how they could get there in 6 minutes, well, either way, by this time the lights were further off in the distance, but still clearly visible, and both deputies could see it. And they told the sisters, that is a helicopter. And Kathy and Cindy said, no, this is not a helicopter. We saw it close up. It was 120 feet long. It had no normal navigation lights, and it was totally silent. And one of the deputies turned to Kathy and mocked her and said, "Do you space talk?" In fact, he told her that she watched too much Mork and Mindy and asked her if they'd been drinking or smoking or taking pills, which really made her angry. And she told him that. She says, "Hey, I don't need this. I've just seen something that terrified me." They do admit that the other deputy was more respectful and questioned them in, quote, a very sincere manner, but both seemed quite skeptical. And still, the officers did question them and then left, and the Wilfongs had no answer to what they saw. And in total, this craft was visible for about 40 minutes, they estimate. And it was the next morning, Cindy went out into the soybean field, and this is when she saw that there was this huge, perfect circle of crushed vegetation. And not just crushed, but matted and woven together in this very strange pattern. And I'll just quote Kathy directly, as she says in her own words, "We didn't know how large it was at first. We found out later it was 44 feet in diameter, and it was a perfect circle. And the weeds and everything were smashed down, but not to the ground. They were like 6 to 8 inches above the ground, and they were intertwined together so much that if you tried to pick it up, the whole thing would come up with it." And in fact, during an interview on a television station, she did try to pick up this vegetation, and you could see the whole thing coming up with it. Now, before the object had apparently landed there or affected the vegetation, the plants were about 5 feet high. And Kathy and Cindy tried to get help, tried to get people interested, but nobody seemed to want to hear it. They called the police again and showed them the landing marks. And the police first said, well, helicopters probably did it, which again the sisters denied. And then they actually accused the sisters of mashing down the plants themselves. So this case was now generating a lot of publicity because the sisters were granting interviews to newspaper reporters and television reporters and talking about how they were being mistreated by the sheriff's department. And this is when Sheriff Malcolm E. Grass wrote a letter to the Greenfield, Indiana Reporter. This was published on November 29th, and he wrote, and I quote, "I don't know what Miss Wilfong and Miss Bridges saw November 8. No one on the Hancock County Sheriff's Department has had specific training in this area. We have to rely on the sources available to us. I hope the experts from the Center of UFO Studies can help identify what they saw. The Hancock County Sheriff's Department did respond quickly, in 6 minutes, to Miss Wilfong's call. Several calls were made to obtain as much information as possible. I hope if anyone sees anything, they will not hesitate to contact the Sheriff's Department, and we will do everything we can to assist them. Sincerely, Malcolm Grass, Sheriff of Hancock County. So, these sisters did call the Center for UFO Studies, which came out and started doing a full-on investigation. But they had a real hard time trying to get people to take this seriously. As Kathy says, we were horrified. We called everyone we knew, but nobody would listen. Something that close, that huge, it's just unbelievable. And they did receive a lot of skepticism from people who said that they probably saw helicopters. But they both disagree. As Kathy says, we see helicopters out here all the time. They fly along the power lines, and you can always hear them coming before you ever see them. But there just wasn't any noise this time. If we hadn't gone outside, we wouldn't have known anything was there. So they called up the Center for UFO Studies, CUFOS, and investigators Alan Hendry and Paul Clark showed up at the farm, interviewed the witnesses, examined the landing traces, and began a whole investigation. And they learned that there were no less than 19 separate reports of strange lights in the Greenfield area alone on that night. They contacted various airports and so forth, the spokesperson for the National Guard, and Army Reserve helicopter fields near Shelbyville and McCordsville said that they had no helicopters in the Greenfield area on that night. So finally, CUFOS released a statement which said in part, "This case has been extremely puzzling. As many as 15 separate witnesses in the area have been interviewed. We are trying to identify the object." And then they said that they were still analyzing the soil samples, so couldn't comment on that. But again, Kathy did interviews for both newspaper and television shows. Both of the sisters did, because they wanted others to know that they had seen something. And they suspected other people had seen it too. As Kathy says, and I quote, "Maybe others saw the same thing, or maybe someone has found a saucer nest and didn't know what it was. If so, and if they come forward and say something about it, then that makes it worthwhile." And apparently it was worthwhile, because after the articles and news reports came out, a whole bunch of other people came forward and said they saw strange lights in the area on that night. But ultimately, the whole experience left both the sisters badly shook up. As Kathy says, "I keep the drapes pinned shut, on the west windows anyway. I was too petrified by the whole experience. If it comes back, I want to be the first one to see it, not have it out there seeing me." And this was not an isolated sighting. There were several other very high-quality reports, both in the days and weeks before the sisters' sighting and after. So apparently the UFOs were very interested for some reason in this area. I think you'll agree that's an undeniable case. Here we have landing traces. They observed this UFO very close up for quite a long period of time. And with so many other people in the area reporting their encounters, I mean, how do you deny something like this? And it's super interesting to me that as soon as they really went public and articles and news stories on television started appearing, a whole new batch of witnesses came forward. And this just speaks to the fact that most people don't step forward and talk about their encounters. Thankfully, times are changing. This subject is going mainstream. The ridicule and disbelief is falling to the wayside to a certain extent. We still have more work to do, but progress has definitely been made thanks to the witnesses who are stepping forward. So these 5 cases, as I'm sure you know, are not even 0.001% of the true number of cases, and just represent the tiny tip of the iceberg of what's going on. But even alone, these 5 cases, as I said in the beginning, provide enough evidence, I think, undeniable evidence, to say that there is reality to the UFO phenomena. So don't tell me there's no evidence. There is, and there's a lot of it. And that's why I wanted to do this episode for you today. So I hope you've enjoyed it, perhaps learned a little bit. I really want to thank you once again for watching. It's always appreciated. Until next time, keep searching for the truth. Keep asking those hard questions. And most important of all, keep having fun. Until next time, bye now.